3 Thursdays in a row, she sat at the same table and left nothing on the tip line. Not a dollar, not a dime, not even the courtesy of a line through the blank, just the absence of anything where something should have been. The woman in the camel coat with the silver hair and the coffee she barely touched. Table 6. Corner booth. The one table in the building with a clean sight line through the front glass. Straight across 9th Street to the ambulance bay of Ashford Memorial Hospital. He noticed that on the 2nd Thursday. He noticed on the 3rd Thursday that she knew his name without being told it. And underneath her saucer, when he cleared the table at 11:15 on a quiet Atlanta night, was a folded piece of paper. Inside a photocopy, a signature at the bottom of an official document, his name, his handwriting, something his hand had never done. 3 Thursdays, that was all it took. 3 Thursdays, same table, same woman, same untouched tip line. And Anthony Wilson, who had spent 6 years perfecting the art of not noticing things noticed. Table 6 sat at the northeast corner of the 9th Street diner, wedged between the window and the cigarette-burned edge of the wall paneling Terry Coleman had been meaning to replace since 2019. It wasn't the best table. The vinyl on the left bench had a split repaired with electrical tape. The overhead light flickered for exactly 3 seconds every time someone ran the industrial dishwasher in the back. It was, by every measurable standard, the least desirable table in the building. But it had the only clean sightline in the house, straight through the front glass, across 9th Street, to the ambulance bay of Ashford Memorial Hospital. She knew that when she sat down, Anthony knew that by the 2nd Thursday, he just didn't know what to do with the knowing. The diner opened at 5 in the morning and never closed. That was the promise of the place. Unspoken and absolute, the lights stayed on, the coffee stayed hot, and whoever pushed through that door at whatever hour wasn't going to be turned away. Nurses came in at 3 a.m., with their badges still clipped to their scrubs and mascara slightly wrong from a long shift. Paramedics ate standing up at the counter, because sitting down felt too permanent when your radio could crackle any second. Night shift security guards from the hospital parking structure ordered the same thing every time and tipped exactly 15%, no more no less, with the mechanical consistency of people who had decided that some decisions were not worth revisiting. Anthony had been working those hours for 4 years. He knew which of the overnight nurses took 3 sugars and said she didn't. He knew that the physician's assistant from the 3rd floor cardiac unit always ordered the egg white omelet and always ate half of it and always stared at her phone for the last 12 minutes of her break like she was waiting for a call that wasn't going to come. He knew the rhythms of the people who came through here, the ticks and tells, and small daily betrayals of people who were tired in that particular way that only night work produces. He had never once told any of them what he used to do for a living. That wasn't a topic, that was just the shape of a door he didn't open. The first Thursday he barely clocked her. She came in at 9:40, which was a slow hour, after the dinner rush, and before the serious late-night crowd. He had 3 other tables, a coffee urn that needed replacing, and a mild disagreement with the kitchen about whether the hash browns counted as sold out or just temporarily unavailable. The woman in the camel coat sat down at table 6 without asking to be seated, which most people did, and which Anthony had long since stopped correcting. She had silver hair, cut sharp at the jaw, not gray silver. The distinction mattered somehow, though he couldn't have explained why. The coat was expensive. Not expensive like somebody's idea of expensive. Expensive like it didn't occur to her that other people might notice what it cost. She ordered black coffee. No food, no phone on the table, no book. She sat with her hands around the mug and looked out the window for an hour and a half, paid in cash from a slim wallet with no visible cards, and left the tip line blank. He cleared the table and forgot her before the door swung shut. The 2nd Thursday he remembered her when she walked in. Same hour, 9:40, same coat, same table, same order. He brought the coffee without asking. That earned him a small nod but no eye contact. She was already turning toward the window. He noticed this time, which way the table faced, noticed it with the specific quality of attention that used to mean something when he was running on 6 hours of sleep and someone's life was in the balance. That internal radar that didn't have a name but had gotten him through 4 years of night rotations without losing a. He stopped. That thought where it lived. The tip line was blank again. Terry Coleman came out of the kitchen near the end of that shift, wiping his hands on his apron the way he always did, a broad man who had run this place for 22 years and wore the evidence of it in the way he moved, like a man who owned every square foot of floor he stood on, because he had mopped it himself, personally, several thousand times. She's back. Terry didn't phrase it as a question. Table 6. Anthony stacked cups into the bus tub. 3rd week. You count? I noticed. Terry looked toward the empty table. The woman was already gone. She tip? No. She do anything that's actually your business? Anthony thought about that for longer than it warranted. She's watching the ambulance bay. People watch all kinds of things. Not from that angle for 90 minutes straight. Terry shrugged the shrug of a man who had seen enough late-night diner behavior to have categorized most of it. Some people find hospitals comforting. Means somebody's working. Means help exists. He went back to the kitchen. Table 7 needs water. Anthony refilled the water. He thought about the angle of table 6. He thought about the way the woman had not once looked down at her hands. He let it sit. The 3rd Thursday he was watching for her before she arrived. 9:38. 2 minutes early, which told him something, though he couldn't say what. Same coat, silver hair, same cut, same exactness. She moved with the economy of someone who had stopped performing the ordinary business of entering a room sometime in the distant past. No hesitation at the door. No scanning for a host. No visible awareness of the other 4 customers in the building. Table 6 like it had her name on the underside of the seat. He brought the coffee before she asked. He set it down and turned to go. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. He stopped. The words weren't loud. They weren't particularly warm. But they landed with a weight that made him turn back around. His name. She had said his name. He looked at his shirt. No name tag. The 9th Street Diner didn't do name tags. Terry's one consistent opinion on the matter of customer service was that the food did the introducing. Anthony had worked here 4 years, and his name had never been stitched onto anything. She was already looking out the window, like she hadn't said it. Like it had slipped out by accident, which it had not. He walked back to the counter and stood there a moment with the coffee pot in his hand, because that was wrong. The whole moment was wrong, in a specific way that he recognized, and had spent 6 years training himself not to follow up on. That trained alertness, that thing in his chest that used to mean pay attention, something here doesn't fit, which was not his job anymore. His job was the coffee, the bus tub, the 3 other tables. He did his job. She stayed until 11:15, paid in cash. The tip line was blank a 3rd time. He watched her button the coat from across the room, without making it look like he was watching, which was another skill he had developed and had never used for anything useful in a long time. He went to clear the table. He lifted the saucer. Under the saucer was a piece of paper folded in 4. He stood there a second with the bus tub balanced against his hip and the folded paper in his hand. The diner was quiet enough that he could hear the specific hum of the reach-in cooler behind the counter. He unfolded the outer sheet. It was handwritten blue ink, small, precise letters, the handwriting of someone who had once been taught penmanship and had never let it slip. A tip is evidence of generosity. I need the record to show I have never given you anything. 9 a.m., 12th floor. Don't tell anyone you came, VC. He stood with the note in his hand and looked at the door, which had stopped, moving a full 3 minutes ago. Then he unfolded the second sheet. It was a photocopy. Crooked, slightly gray the way photocopies go when someone is working fast or scared or both. The letterhead at the top read Ashford Memorial Hospital, Internal Incident Review Confidential. The date in the upper right corner was the 14th of March. The unit number in the second line Anthony could have recited in his sleep for the past 6 years. He read the document through once, twice. His eyes moved down to the bottom of the page. to the line marked Crew Acknowledgement Attending Personnel. The signature there read, Anthony Wilson. He had never signed that form. He had never seen that form. He had asked for the file 3 times during the review that ended his career, and 3 times been told that internal quality documents were not released to individual employees. He was looking at his own handwriting doing something his hand had never done. The diner hum continued. The reach-in cooler. The distant percussion of Terry scrubbing something in the sink. 4 customers in the building, none of them watching him. The note and the photocopy sat flat in his palm like evidence, which was exactly what they were. He put them both in his shirt pocket, finished clearing the table, returned the bus tub to the station, and clocked out 14 minutes early. Without explaining why to anyone, he got home at 12 past midnight. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on Clifton, 8 blocks east of the diner. He had lived here 3 years, the longest he'd stayed anywhere since the job ended. The radiator in the hallway made the same sound it had made every night of those 3 years. A low rhythmic knock that he had initially found alarming and had since become something close to comforting. Consistency in small mechanical things. He sat at the kitchen table with the 2 sheets flat in front of him under the overhead light that turned everything slightly yellow. The apartment smelled faintly of the dinner Brandon had made before Anthony's shift, some variation on pasta, with what Brandon called sauce and Anthony called ambition. His son was 18. Had been, technically, since the end of August, the summer between high school and whatever came next, which was still a question mark. Brand approached with a calm that Anthony sometimes found reassuring and sometimes found alarming, depending on his own mood. Brandon was asleep. Anthony could hear the specific quality of quiet from that room, not the absence of sound but the presence of someone sleeping without worry, which was its own sound if you'd spent enough time being the adult responsible for it. He read the document again. The unit number was Unit 9. He had worked Unit 9 for 11 months before the 14th of March. He knew that vehicles' tendencies, the way a person knows the particular creak of their own front door, the passenger side visor, that wouldn't stay up, the radio that needed a second punch before it held the frequency, the monitor and defibrillator unit that lived in the side cabinet, and that he had checked at the start of every shift for 11 months because Victor Bryant had shown him how to check it properly on his 2nd week on the job, which brought him to Victor Bryant. Victor had been his partner that night. The 2 of them on Unit 9, 3rd rotation of the night, when the call came in at 2:07 a.m. 9th Street and Clifton. He had not spoken to Victor in 6 years. Not since 2 weeks after the revocation came down, when Victor had stopped returning messages. Anthony had tried 3 times and then understood the shape of the silence and had stopped. Trying, the note said VC 12th floor. Don't tell anyone. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at the note and the photocopy, and knowing with the particular certainty of someone who has spent years walking a careful perimeter around a dangerous thing exactly who VC was. Vanessa Carter. He had known her face before he knew her name, the way people in this neighborhood knew it. The portrait in the hospital lobby, beside the framed photograph of her father, Arthur Carter, the placard read, Founder, Ashford Medical Group, 1974. The family name was on the front of the building, on the ambulances, on the badge of every nurse who ate at his counter, on the letterhead of the document that had ended his career. He had Googled her once, 2 years after the revocation, on a slow Tuesday when the combination of 3 a.m. silence and one too many bad memories had pushed him into a corner. He'd found what he expected. Vanessa Carter, 35 years old, his age exactly, born the same year, which felt irrelevant, but wasn't CEO of Ashford Medical Group since her father's retirement 4 years prior. Business publications quoted her in language that fell halfway between corporate and clinical. She had expanded the hospital's community outreach. She had restructured the insurance contracts. She had not, in any article he found from any year, ever mentioned the 14th of March or Unit 9 or the name Anthony Wilson. He closed the laptop and didn't look again. Now there was a note with her initials on his kitchen table and a photocopy of a document bearing a signature he had never written. There was another envelope on the table. It had come 9 days ago from the state licensing board. He'd opened it standing in the hallway, still in his coat, and read it once and set it on the kitchen table, and had not picked it up since. Not because he didn't know what it said, because he knew exactly what it said, and had already made his decision about it, quietly and without telling anyone, the way a person decides not to open a bill they can't pay. The letter explained, in the flat institutional voice of an agency performing a statutory obligation, that recent amendments to the review statute now permitted individuals holding permanent revocations to submit a single petition for reconsideration, that his window was open, that a hearing had been calendared, 14 days, 1 petition, 1 appearance, no second window. The statute was explicit about that. If he used this opportunity and failed, and he would fail, standing in a room full of people with credentials and files and lawyers offering nothing but his own memory of a bad night, and the word permanent already written on his record, it wasn't just a loss. It was the end of the question. Permanent became permanent in a way that left no ambiguity and no hope, and no more nights sitting with the small possibility that maybe someday, somehow, the door wasn't entirely sealed. He had decided not to go. The decision sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong, not painful enough to act on, just present enough to feel. Now the photocopy was on the table. Now VC was asking him to come to the 12th floor at 9 a.m. and not tell anyone. He sat there long enough that the overhead light started to bother him. He turned it off, sat in the ambient glow from the street through the kitchen window, thought about what a sensible man would do with a note like this from a woman like that. A sensible man would understand immediately that people like Vanessa Carter did not hand out rescues, that whatever she had, whatever she needed, whatever the shape of this was, it wasn't free. Nothing at that altitude was free. He thought about table 6, about 90 minutes, 3 Thursdays in a row, watching a door. He thought about the kind of watching that wasn't idle. That was the other kind, the kind with a purpose underneath it. He put the note and the photocopy under the fruit bowl, the bowl that hadn't held fruit in at least a year, but that Brandon used to collect the small change from his pockets, and went to check that Brandon's door was shut, which it was, and went to bed. He didn't sleep. Around 4 in the morning he got up and made coffee he didn't drink, and stood at the kitchen window looking down at the wet street. The diner sign was visible from here if he leaned slightly right. It was always on, that orange-yellow glow that never quite went out. 2 blocks off and steady as a lighthouse nobody had decommissioned. He had stood at this window before and found something in that constancy. The city is awake, someone is working. If you need a place, there is a place. He thought about the man in the canvas jacket from 2 years back. 3rd booth, middle of a Tuesday. Anthony had been refilling the sugar caddies when something at the edge of his vision registered wrong, a man's left hand not quite opening, the slight lag between intention and execution in the fingers, the way the mouth moved and the words arrived late, a half beat behind, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. One eye had gone distant in a specific way that Anthony recognized before he could stop himself from recognizing it. His hands had wanted to move. That automatic reaching toward the patient, toward the assessment that the body doesn't forget, regardless of what the paperwork says. His mouth had wanted to start asking the sequence. Time of onset, medication list. Can you smile for me? Can you lift both arms? He'd done none of it. He'd walked to the register, picked up the phone, and told the dispatcher there was a man at the 9th Street diner, showing signs of a stroke, across the street from Ashford Memorial. Please send a unit. Then he'd stood back against the counter with a coffee pot. He didn't remember picking up and watched paramedics he didn't know do his work. Terry had said, "You did good catching that." He'd said the ambulance did it. He'd cleared the booth. He still thought about it sometimes. The coffee pot, the standing back, the feeling of watching someone else's hands do the thing his hands knew how to do and not being allowed to close the distance. He drank the cold coffee at 5:15 and went to wake Brandon at 6:30 and made pancakes badly, which was the only way he made them. Brandon ate 4 without commentary, which was the same as a compliment. "There's a mitten situation," Brandon said. He had the notebook open beside his cereal bowl. The notebook had a cover he'd decorated himself in black marker. The words "Lost Things" in block letters, surrounded by small drawings of found objects. A key, a single earring, a hat, found it outside the library, red with white stripes, infant size. Infants got no business being outside the library alone. The mitten has no business being outside the library alone. The infant presumably got home. Brandon wrote something, curved his hand around it, the way he always did when writing the story. Anthony had never read those stories over his shoulder. He figured they were private, the way most things written in a notebook were private. "I think someone's Christmas shopping and the bag tore. It was on the sidewalk in front of the yeah. That tracks. Solid theory. I'm working another angle though." He closed the notebook. The whole infant abandoned mitten thing, too easy. Anthony looked at his son for a moment. 18 years old, already had a theory of everything. Got that from somewhere. Not from the years of careful silence Anthony had maintained on most subjects. That was its own kind of teaching. Whether that what he'd meant it to be or not. He cleared the plates. Brandon grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. "You okay?" Brandon didn't look at him when he asked it. He was adjusting the jacket collar, looking at the middle distance. "Yeah, you made the pancakes twice as bad as usual. The second ones were archaeological. Long shift." Brandon nodded. Nodded like he accepted the answer. Nodded like he had learned. At some point, Anthony hadn't tracked closely enough, that some answers were the available answers, and not the true ones, and that accepting the available answer was its own kind of grace. The door closed. Anthony stood in the kitchen, with the plate he'd been about to put in the sink, and thought about Grace. At 8:40 he was standing on the Satibos and front of the Ashford Medical Group Administrative Tower, in his one good jacket. The building was 12 floors of glass that had gone grey in the morning overcast. The Ashford name in raised letters above the entrance, each letter roughly the size of Anthony's torso. He had walked past this building approximately 400 times in the last 4 years, and had developed the specific urban skill of not looking at it directly. The way you learn not to look at certain things that live in the peripheral vision of your daily route. He looked at it directly now. Inside, the lobby was marble and controlled air and the low-level purposefulness of people who worked in buildings, where the carpet was this thick. A security desk. A portrait wall, Arthur Carter in oil, the founder, expansive and confident in that dated way of men, photographed for posterity in the 1980s. Beside it, the newer portrait, smaller but better lit, Vanessa Carter, photographed at some architectural angle, meant to convey both leadership and accessibility, wearing a blazer that cost more than Anthony's monthly take-home. The young man at the reception desk took Anthony's name without asking about the absence of a coat check or an appointment, directed him to the elevator bank, told him the 12th floor with the placid neutrality of someone trained to behave as though everything was expected. The 12th floor did not look like a hospital. It looked like a place where decisions about hospitals got made by people who didn't have to smell the disinfectant, carpet that absorbed sound, glass-walled conference rooms, a corridor that ended at a corner office facing north, where Atlanta's morning spread itself in shades of gray and steel. He didn't knock. The door was slightly open. He pushed it. Vanessa Carter was already standing. She was taller than the portrait suggested. She wore a dark blazer over a fitted top the color of charcoal, and the silver hair was the same jaw length, precise, not a single strand out of the arrangement. She was 35, same year he was born. There was something in her face that was sharp without being unkind. The particular expression of someone who had been responsible for many things for a long time and had stopped apologizing for what that looked like. Beautiful. Not in the way that asked you to say so. In the way that simply was. "Close it." She said it without raising her voice. He closed the door. He did not sit. He took the note, and the photocopy from his inside pocket and placed them on the edge of her desk, squared up like a check he was refusing to cash. That isn't my signature. I know. Then, say the rest of it. She came around the desk and stayed on her feet too, both hands resting on the back of her chair. She had the voice of a woman who had spent a long time being listened to and had learned to use it economically. No warm-up, no cushioning, no executive preamble. She told him about Unit 9. The cardiac monitor and defibrillator assigned to that vehicle had been operating 91 days past its calibration certification as of the 14th of March. Not broken, she made that distinction clearly. Not visibly malfunctioning. Out of certification, which in a review meant the readings it produced could not be defended, and which in an ambulance at 2 in the morning meant a paramedic, making decisions off numbers that no one in the building could stand behind after the fact. The crews had not been told. Anthony stood very still. Why? Not a question. The tone of it was wrong for a question. It came out flat, like a word you'd looked at too long. Because at the time the maintenance failure was identified, she said, Ashford Medical was 11 weeks from closing a merger. The fleet maintenance contract was the kind of small, systemic, documented failure that would have triggered a full compliance review. In a compliance review, every book opens. In an open book, a pattern of deferred maintenance becomes evidence of a broader operational deficit. A systemic problem is a valuation problem. A valuation problem in the middle of a merger is a different kind of catastrophe than a bad outcome on a single call. A personnel problem, she said, is a personnel problem. So somebody needed a name. And the cheapest name in the building, Anthony said, was a 29-year-old medic with no attorney. She did not look away from him. Yes, he had imagined this conversation. Not often he'd made a deliberate practice of not imagining it, but in the unguarded 3 a.m. hours, when the brain did what the brain did regardless of policy, he had sometimes constructed the version of this moment where someone finally said the thing out loud. In every version, he'd imagined shouting. The specific release of 6 years compressed into volume. He didn't shout. Something in him went quiet instead. Level. The same calibration his body used to perform on bad calls, when the scene was worse than the dispatch had indicated, and losing it wasn't available as an option. 6 years, he said. Do you understand what that is? She didn't answer. That isn't a bad year. That's a whole different life. I've got a son who thinks his father used to help people in an ambulance and wasn't allowed to anymore and doesn't know why. I let him believe the paperwork was true. For 6 years I let him believe that because I believed it a little myself, because I was there and she died. I know what it is. You don't. A beat. The north-facing window held 12 floors of gray morning. She didn't contest it. No, she said. I don't. He waited for the offer then. He was braced for it. The job. The settlement. The number calibrated to make a man feel the transaction had been fair even as it completed the original one. That was how things at this altitude worked. He'd had 6 years to learn the grammar of it. He'd already decided what his face would do when the number came. It didn't come. I'm not offering you anything, Vanessa said. I'm telling you I'll testify. The word sat in the room differently than the words before it. She held his gaze under oath to the state licensing board that the equipment on Unit 9 was operating outside its calibration certification on the 14th of March, that the maintenance failure had been known at the administrative level before that night, that the incident review was constructed after the fact to place the failure on the attending crew. Then do it. He said it before the sentence had fully finished registering. My hearing is in 14 days. That's the problem. She came around the chair and sat carefully, the way people sit when the body has started charging for movement, and she explained. The Ashford Foundation, the charitable trust attached to the hospital system, was currently funded through her personal position in the parent company. It carried the ongoing treatment costs of just over 4,000 patients, dialysis, oncology, long-course care for people who would otherwise become collection accounts. People's in this story, people who did not have the money to be sick in the way they were sick, and who were sick in the way they were sick regardless. The day she gave sworn testimony that she had participated, in falsifying an internal review. 3 things happened at once. The board removed her, the insurers opened a fraud posture, and every dollar in that trust froze pending litigation. 90 days, she said. The next disbursement clears in 82. After that, those patients are funded through the cycle, no matter what happens to me. And what happens to me in the meantime? She said it without decoration, which was somehow worse than if she'd tried to wrap it in something softer. You lose. The room had a particular quality of quiet that expensive carpet and thick glass produced. Anthony stood in the middle of it and understood with absolute clarity the full architecture of what she was asking. There is no second window, he said. One petition. That's what the statute gives me. If I walk into that room in 14 days, with nothing with my own word against a 6-year-old file, that's the end of it. Permanent stays permanent. And this time it's permanent because I used the one turn I had. I understand the arithmetic. Then you understand you're asking me to absorb 6 more years so your ledger balances. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften it. She held the geometry of what she'd said and let it stand. I'm asking, Vanessa Carter said, and I'm aware I have no standing to ask. He picked the 2 sheets up from the edge of her desk and put them back in his jacket. Not because he was leaving, he hadn't decided that yet, but because that photocopy was the only object in the world that had ever contradicted the official version of his life. And he was not going to leave it on her desk. At the door, he stopped. Why now? He said. 6 years. 3 Thursdays you sat in my diner watching an ambulance bay and left nothing on the table. 3 Thursdays you knew where I worked and what I poured for a living. Why now? Vanessa Carter looked at the window, at 12 floors of gray morning over Atlanta. At the ambulance bay visible from up here too, if you knew where to look. She didn't answer. He let himself out. The young man at the desk in the corridor didn't look up. The elevator moved without urgency. In the lobby, Arthur Carter's oil portrait hung in the same spot it had always hung, and the letters on the front of the building were the same the same size they'd always been, and the doorman held the door open with the same polished efficiency as people who hold doors for a living. Anthony walked out onto the sidewalk. The city was doing what it did, moving, indifferent, continuous. He stood there for a moment in his one good jacket with a photocopy of a signature that wasn't his, and a note from a woman who had just told him she needed something from him before she would give him back the thing that was already his. He started walking, not toward the diner, not toward home. Just walking the way the body sometimes needs to do when the brain has received more than it can process, standing still. Past the corner of 9th and Clifton. Past the laundromat that was never open before 10. Past the community health clinic where the security guard nodded at him through the glass. Because Anthony had eaten at the diner for years, and so had the security guard. 6 years. He had worked the loading docks for 2 of those years across the river, night shifts moving freight from 11 p.m. until 7, because it was the only thing available that paid enough, and asked nothing about where he'd worked before. He had taken the diner job when Terry hired him without an interview, which in Anthony's experience was either a red flag or a mercy, and Terry Coleman had turned out to be the second kind. He had found this apartment, enrolled Brandon in the high school 12 blocks north, and constructed a life out of available materials. It wasn't a bad life. He had never told himself it was a bad life. But it was a life built entirely on top of the decision to let the story stay where it had landed. And now Vanessa Carter had told him the story was wrong. She had handed him the first piece of evidence that the version written into the official record had never been true. And in the same breath she had told him he would have to wait 90 days to use it, which was 76th longer than the window the law had given him. He stopped at the corner of Clifton and Ponce, traffic light cycling through its colors with no one waiting. He looked at the intersection for a moment. He went home. Brandon was out. Some combination of library and a friend whose name Anthony never managed to track an era of his son's social life that moved at a velocity Anthony found both reassuring and slightly dizzying. The apartment was empty in the specific way it was when Brandon hadn't been gone long, jacket hook still swinging slightly, kitchen chair not quite pushed in. Anthony sat at the table with his jacket still on. He took the note and the photocopy back out and looked at them in the afternoon light, which was better than the yellow overhead light, and which showed him more detail in the photocopy's typography. The old Ashford Memorial letterhead, the version they'd stopped using 4 years back, replaced when the hospital system rebranded after the merger. The date, the unit number, the incident summary, in the specific bureaucratic language he recognized because it was the language that had erased him. Deviation from protocol, delay in intervention, attending crew responsibility, and at the bottom, his signature, his name in his hand, doing something his hand had not done. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about Victor Bryant. 3 weeks after the revocation, Victor had stopped answering. No explanation, no final message, no closure of any kind, just absence where a partner had been. At the time, Anthony had understood it the way you understand things. You don't have the capacity to investigate. Something happened. Something closed. The person is gone. He'd had other problems. He thought about Vanessa Carter, looking out the window on the 12th floor and not answering his last question. Why now? He didn't know. But he understood. Sitting in this story, but he understood, at his kitchen table with his jacket still on, that the answer to that question would tell him whether he was being offered something real or being positioned for a second transaction in a long series of transactions he'd never fully understood. 14 days. 1 petition. He left the papers under the fruit bowl and went to change out of the good jacket. He had a shift in 3 hours. Tables to clear, coffee to pour. The diner that never closed because that was the promise. Somebody's always here, the lights stay on. Whoever comes through that door, at whatever hour, is not going to be sent back into the dark. He thought about that promise on the walk over. He thought about a different kind of promise, the kind made without words, over 4 years of made pancakes and driven miles, and questions answered and questions left unanswered. The kind that said, whatever I give you, I will give you clean. Whatever I tell you, I will tell you true. He had never quite managed the second half of that. Not yet. The diner was lit up from a block away, orange-yellow in the early evening, exactly the way it always was. He pushed through the door. Terry was behind the counter reading something at arm's length, glasses presumably still in the truck. Table 3 wants the check. Anthony put on the apron. He worked the full shift. The overnight crowd moved through in its usual rotations. 2 nurses from the 4th floor cardiac unit came in together at 10:15 and sat at the counter with the weary synchronicity of people who had just survived the same thing and weren't ready to separate yet. Anthony poured the coffee without asking and set down the creamers and did not intrude on whatever they were processing. One of them, Stephanie Harris, had been coming to this counter for 3 years. She had a way of delivering information, medical, interpersonal, civic, whatever, that made you sit up straight before you registered that you'd straightened, some quality of precision in her delivery that had nothing to do with volume. She didn't say anything tonight. She didn't. Wrapped both hands around her mug and stared at the distance between the counter and the window. He let her do that. Around 1 a.m., after the paramedic crew from the station 4 blocks over had come and gone and the kitchen had quieted to just the sound of the prep cook cleaning the grill, Anthony sat on the stool near the register and looked at his own hands. Good hands. He had always had that, the steadiness, the ability to work without shaking in conditions where shaking would have been completely understandable. It wasn't composure exactly, more like his nervous system had been routed differently, had learned somewhere early to keep the signal clean, even when the situation was generating a lot of noise. Those hands had read a monitor on the night of the 14th of March. The monitor had told him a number. He had made a decision based on that number, and somewhere above him, in a building whose name was on the door of this diner, someone had known, before that number ever appeared on the screen, that the number could not be trusted. He had spent 6 years carrying the weight of that night, as though he had authored it entirely. That was the quiet devastation of the thing, not the revocation itself, not the formal loss, but the slow corrosion of his own certainty, because he had been there. Because the outcome had been the outcome. Because the review had said what it had said, and the signature had said what it had said, and somewhere in the architecture of all that official language, he had found enough ambiguity to wonder, in his worst hours, whether a better person would have caught something he had missed, whether 31 seconds of looking at the wrong numbers had cost Latasha Green the rest of her life. He had never let himself complete that sentence out loud. Not to Terry. Not to the friend whose floor he'd slept on in the immediate aftermath. Not to Brandon, who had been 12 years old when it happened, and who had been told, in the simplest available language, that his father used to work on an ambulance and wasn't allowed to anymore, and who had accepted that the way kids accept weather. The acceptance had been its own kind of weight. He turned the photocopy over in his mind the way you work a stone in your pocket. The unit number, the date, the calibration gap 91 days past certification. He had never had that piece before. He had stood in a review hearing and said that Victor had done the pre-shift check and that it had been reported, and the file had not reflected any such report, and that had been the end of the sentence. The file chaired by a man whose name was on the document that had ended him. He needed to know who VC was in the specific way you need to know the source of a current before you decide whether to touch the water. He already knew her name, her title, her family's relationship to the institution. What he needed to know was what she actually wanted, because what she'd said in the office and what she wanted were not necessarily the same country. I'm not offering you anything. I'm telling you I'll testify. Under oath, after the window closed, he thought about what a smart man would do. A smart man would fold both sheets of paper into the trash, put the licensing letter on top and go back to work Thursday and pour coffee and make the bad pancakes and walk Brandon to whatever came next after the summer of lost things. He had a job. He had an apartment with a working boiler. He had a son who thought his father was a decent man who'd had something unfair happen to him, and who had never had reason to revise that opinion in any downward direction. Every good thing in this apartment had been built on top of the quiet decision to let the story rest where it had landed. If he walked into that building and it went wrong, and things involving people at that altitude went wrong, for people at altitude with a reliability you could calibrate by, he wouldn't just lose the appeal. He would lose the particular version of himself that his son had been allowed to believe in, because Brandon would ask. The 18-year-old who kept a notebook of lost things would sit down at the kitchen table and ask, and Anthony would have no clean answer. That was the math he'd been avoiding since the letter arrived 9 days ago. Now there was a second equation on the table. He closed out the register at 6:45. Terry was already there for the morning handoff, coffee in hand, reading something on his phone with winking focus of a man who had decided against getting the prescription updated. You're quiet tonight, Terry said. I'm always quiet. Quieter. Anthony took off the apron and hung it on the hook. You ever think about? He started, differently. You ever have something that needed to get done, and you knew what needed to get done, and you still couldn't figure out how to start it? Terry looked at him over the phone. I've been trying to replace that wall paneling for 5 years. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. Terry set the phone down. You mean the kind where the doing of it costs something, and the not doing costs something different, and you can't figure out which cost you're less able to carry. He picked up his coffee. Yeah, I know that kind. Anthony nodded. Whatever it is, Terry said. You don't have to tell me, but if you need a few days I can move Darnell to cover. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're quiet. Those are different things. He went back to his phone with the serenity of a man who had said his piece. Go home. Sleep. The pancakes will still be terrible tomorrow. Anthony walked home in the early morning. The city was doing that thing it does just before the light shifts, a particular quality of almost dawn, where everything is present but slightly unresolved, like a sentence that hasn't found its period yet. The diner sign behind him. Ashford Memorial ahead. The 12 floors of glass that held, somewhere on the top floor, a woman who knew something she'd known for 6 years and had chosen now to say. He thought about Latasha Green's face. He had not seen a photograph. He'd heard her name in the review. He'd read the incident summary. He had constructed her from the outline of what the documents said about her 44 years old, complaint of chest pain, third-floor apartment, the building on Clifton, but he had no image, just an outline. And in that outline, somewhere, the 31 seconds on the monitor. The numbers that weren't trustworthy, the decision made in the dark with the tools available. He stopped in front of his building. The sky was doing something complicated to the east. He thought about sitting at the kitchen table with the overhead light, and a sun in the next room, and a document with his forged name at the bottom and a note that said, "I need the record to show I have never given you anything." He thought, "I'm not going because I believe she came to save me. Nobody handed rescues out from the 12th floor.
He thought,
I'm not going because I think I can win," he thought, standing on the sidewalk in the almost dawn with his one good jacket and 6 years of accumulated quiet. "I'm going because someone put my name on a document and made it mean something my hand never agreed to. And I have spent 6 years carrying a sentence I did not write. And I want to know whose hand held the pen." He went upstairs. Brandon's light was already on. Anthony stood in the hallway outside the kitchen for a moment, listening to the particular sounds of his son, making coffee badly, the cabinet, the drawer, the specific splash of someone who hadn't quite mastered the ratio. Normal morning sounds. The sounds of a life that had been built, carefully, out of available materials, in the space left by everything the 14th of March had taken. He went into the kitchen. Brandon looked up from the coffee maker, looked at his father's face for exactly 1 second, didn't ask, handed him a cup. Anthony drank it. It was too strong and slightly wrong on the ratio, but it was warm, and the apartment smelled like morning, and his son was standing on the other side of the counter with his own cup, looking out the window at the city, starting to resolve itself from gray into something more definite. They stood there together a minute, without saying anything. Some conversations don't start in the kitchen at dawn. Some of them start at a diner table at 11:45 at night, under a folded piece of paper and a forged signature. Some of them have been waiting 6 years for the conditions to shift enough that a person can find the door. Anthony set down his cup. He went to get the 2 sheets of paper from under the fruit bowl. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked at them for a long moment in the morning light, better light than the yellow overhead, better light than the ambulance bay at 2 a.m., the clearest light he'd read them by yet. He was going to the 12th floor, not because Vanessa Carter had asked him to, not because she had something he needed, though she did, but because the question she'd failed to answer, why now, was itself a piece of information, and he had spent enough years in the dark about the things that had shaped him that he had stopped being willing to stay there by default. The city outside the window was doing what cities do, moving forward, indifferent, continuous. He folded the papers, put them back in the jacket pocket, made a note on his phone to call the licensing board in the morning and confirm the hearing date hadn't moved. 14 days, 1 chance. He poured more of Brandon's terrible coffee and held the cup with both hands and looked at the window and thought about Latasha Green, whose face he didn't know, whose door had been on the 3rd floor on the night his hands had wanted to move and been given numbers that couldn't be trusted. He thought about what it cost to carry a sentence you didn't write. He thought about what it cost to put it down. He went back 9 days later. Not because he'd softened, not because the arithmetic had changed, because he'd spent 9 nights turning the photocopy over in his mind, and had arrived finally at the thing it wasn't. It was a copy. Copies could be called anything. A draft, a fabrication, a document produced by a disgruntled executive with a personal grievance and a ticking medical clock. In a room full of institutional lawyers, a photocopy produced by the only person it helped was not evidence. It was a story. And Anthony had spent 6 years learning the difference between those two things. He needed the original maintenance record, the certification date in the system's own hand. He went back to the 12th floor without calling ahead, because calling ahead gave the front desk time to prepare a polite version of unavailable. He took the elevator up and found the same young man at the corridor desk and said his name with a flatness that communicated he would be standing there, regardless of what came next. The young man picked up the phone, looked at Anthony once, made the call, told him to go through. Vanessa was at the window when he walked in. She turned. She looked like someone who had slept badly and had decided not to cover it. He asked for the original maintenance log for Unit 9, quarter ending April of that year, 6 years back. The calibration certification date in the system's own record. That was what he needed. Not the photocopy, the source. She didn't answer right away, and that pause too, maybe 3 seconds, was the first time he saw her afraid. There is no original. She said it the way a person reads their own chart aloud in an empty room. The fleet maintenance log for that quarter was destroyed, not lost, destroyed. In the ordinary course, under a retention schedule that was revised 8 weeks after the 14th of March. Somebody revised the retention schedule. Somebody did. So the testimony she could give was a woman with a motive saying words, without a contemporaneous record, without the maintenance log in the system's own hand. She was a former executive with a grievance and a health problem, and any competent attorney would take her apart in 20 minutes. She'd known that for 6 years. It was why she'd never opened her mouth. The photocopy was evidence of the photocopy's existence and nothing else. Anthony stood in the middle of the room and felt the floor of the conversation tilt. And for the first time in 6 years, it tilted toward him. You didn't come to my diner to atone. The words came out quiet, level. The same one register his voice found on bad calls when getting louder wasn't available. You came because you needed something. You needed a witness who was on that truck. Someone still angry enough to be useful. Someone the board couldn't dismiss. She didn't deny it. And now you should be afraid. Not a threat, an observation. Because I remember that night better than any document ever will. And until about 90 seconds ago, I didn't know I had anything you wanted. He walked out. She didn't call after him. He drove home with the radio off. The specific silence of a car with the radio off is different from other silences. It has the quality of a held breath. Every stop sign, every intersection, every stretch of ponce that he had driven 400 times, all of it registering differently now. The way familiar landscape changes when the weather changes above it. He had leverage. That was the new piece. The thing he hadn't had when he walked in. Vanessa Carter needed him present, credible and cooperative for her. Testimony to mean anything. A witness who had been on that unit on that night and who could speak to the sequence with the authority of someone who had actually been in the back of that truck. Without him, she was a rich woman confessing to a crime in a way that implicated her without actually proving his innocence. With him, it was a corroborated account. 2 separate sources pointing at the same failure from different angles. She needed the hearing to happen. She needed him in that room. And the hearing was in 5 days, which meant the window. She'd asked him to close the 90-day gap. The 4,000 patients, the frozen disbursement was not the only window in play. There was his window, and his window was closing faster. He parked on Clifton and sat in the car for a moment. Brandon was at the library. Thursday afternoon, which meant the Lost Things notebook was probably already open on whatever table he'd claimed, and some newfound object was being assigned a history. Anthony thought about that notebook, the patience of it, the way his son had decided, at some point that Anthony hadn't witnessed directly, that every lost thing deserved a story, that it had belonged to someone, that the person was somewhere, missing it. He got out of the car and went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and then at 1:17 in the morning, when the apartment had been quiet for 2 hours, and he'd been cycling through the same set of thoughts until they'd worn grooves, a memory surfaced, sideways. The way memories come when you're not hunting them. An envelope. Victor Bryant had sent him an envelope. 3 weeks after the revocation. He'd had Victor's handwriting on the front, that particular blocky print, all caps, that Victor had used for everything from grocery lists to medical notes. Anthony had been sleeping on a friend's floor in Decatur at the time, between apartments, between jobs, between whatever came before and whatever came after. The envelope had arrived, and he'd looked at it and understood immediately, with the full-body certainty of someone reading a situation rather than a document, that whatever was inside was either an apology or an explanation, and he couldn't survive either one. Not then, not at that particular moment, which had been the worst one, worse than the hearing, worse than the formal notification, because the hearing had at least had structure, and the notification had at least been expected, but the weeks after were formless and heavy, and sitting on someone else's floor, with no job and no license, and a 12-year-old he was, trying to hold steady. Opening a letter from his former partner felt like it would be the thing that actually broke something. So he hadn't opened it. He'd put it in the shoebox that lived under his bed. He had moved 3 times since Decatur. The shoebox had moved with him each time, because it also contained his father's watch and the hospital bracelet from the day Brenton was born, and those weren't things he could lose or discard, so the box traveled intact and he'd never once lifted the lid. Not in 6 years. It was under the bed right now. He sat at the kitchen table at 1:17 in the morning and processed the specific absurdity of that, the thing he'd needed for 6 years, the thing that could have changed the shape of every decision he'd made in the long stretch between then and now. He had carried it through 3 apartments and never looked. He went to the bedroom, got down on the floor, pulled the box out from under the bed. It was lighter than he remembered, or he was different. One of those. He sat on the floor with the box in his lap and opened it. His father's watch, the hospital bracelet, white plastic, the kind that left a mark on your wrist if you wore it long enough. Some photographs he didn't examine, and near the bottom, the envelope, Victor's handwriting, all caps, and at some point in the 6 years, the glue had let go at one corner on its own, the way adhesive gives up when nobody's asking it to hold anymore. He opened it. Inside was a single carbon sheet, yellow, gone soft as cloth with age, the way carbon paper does when it's been folded and unfolded enough times or just breathed on by years. It was the daily equipment verification form for Unit 9. The 14th of March, filled out at the start of shift in Victor Bryant's blocky handwriting, every line item checked in sequence. The way Anthony had watched Victor check them every shift for 11 months. At the bottom, in the section for the cardiac monitor and defibrillator, the calibration certification date, copied from the label on the unit, and beside it, circled twice in blue ink, circled twice with the pen, pressed hard enough that it showed through to the other side, out of cert, reported to Sue PV. Before the call, before dispatch. Before Lasher Green ever called for help or anyone ever picked up a phone or Unit 9 ever pulled out of the bay. Anthony sat on the floor of his dark bedroom with his hands shaking badly enough that he set the carbon sheet on the carpet. And when he set it down, when the sheet lay flat on the floor, and he saw the back of it, he stopped. Across the reverse side of the carbon sheet, in the particular texture of a medium not designed for drawing on, in the uneven pressure of someone who hadn't understood what they were drawing on, was a picture. A tall person, dark uniform, one arm raised in a wave. Beside the person, a boxy shape, white, with a stripe across the middle and 4 circles at the bottom that were wheels, definitely. Wheels, unmistakably and earnestly wheels. Underneath, in enormous careful letters, the concentrated printing of someone young, who was trying very hard. A.D. Anthony had kept a shoebox under his bed. Brandon had found it, at some point, some rainy afternoon, while doing whatever 18-year-olds had once done as children, when left to their own devices in a small apartment, hunting, exploring, the way kids move through contained spaces with the instinct of archaeologists. He'd found the box, found the yellow sheet inside, seen a blank side and used it, put it back. The evidence that could undo 6 years had been living under his bed the entire time, on the other side of a drawing of his father. He sat on the floor of the dark bedroom and did not move for a long time. He made 6 photocopies the next morning. Used the machine at the library on Ponce, not the one at the diner, because the library machine didn't require a conversation with anyone who knew him. He made 6 copies and left the original in a bank envelope at the Regions branch on North Highland, in a safe deposit box he opened on the spot, because 6 years had taught him exactly one practical thing about how institutions worked. If you have 1 copy of the thing that can save you, you have 0. 6 years was a good teacher, expensive, but thorough. He went to find Victor Bryant. The address wasn't hard. People's addresses weren't hard when you'd been their partner for 11 months. When you'd eaten lunch in the same parking lots and waited in the same hospital bays. And once, during a particularly slow winter Tuesday, had catalogued every house on a residential call by the quality of the Christmas lights. Anthony knew the general direction of Victor's life, the way you know the topography of a place you once moved through, not current, not precise, but directionally accurate. Victor lived 40 minutes north. A duplex off a county road with a chain-link fence and a boat in the side yard that had the particular look of something purchased with intention and then gradually revised down to decoration. The grass around the boat had grown through the trailer in a way that suggested it had been sitting there for at least 2 seasons. Anthony rang the bell and waited. Victor came to the door and recognized him before Anthony had finished saying his name. He could see it, the recognition arriving and the response to the recognition arriving, right it, particular sequence in a person's face when they've been waiting for something they hoped wouldn't come. He said nothing for a moment, then he opened the door wider and stepped back. The inside of the duplex was tidy in the way of a man who lived alone and had made a private agreement with himself about standards. A couch, a television, a kitchen table with 1 chair pulled out at an angle from the last time someone had sat at it. Family photographs on the side wall, a woman in her 50s, formal portrait style, the specific composition of a photograph taken for a purpose. Victor's mother. Anthony had met her once, briefly, during a shift handoff. She'd brought food. He didn't ask about the photograph. He held out the photocopy of the carbon sheet. Victor took it, looked at it the way a person looks at a photograph of themselves from a time before recognition and distance occupying the same expression simultaneously. I need you at the hearing. Anthony kept it direct. No preamble. 5 minutes. You wrote it, you circled it, you reported it. All you have to do is say you did. Victor held the sheet for a moment longer. Then he set it on the table. I can't. You wrote it. I know what I wrote. Victor's jaw moved, something working through him. I called it in to the supervisor an hour before we rolled. Reported it, logged it, same as I recorded every call I ever made, because my father told me the day I started on a truck that a man who doesn't document doesn't exist. 3 days after I mailed you the carbon, somebody from the Ashford system sat down with me and explained my situation. The bottom dropped out of the sentence before it finished. They paid you. Victor's eyes went wet and furious at the same time, both at once. He didn't look away, which was the only decent thing in the room right now. My mother was 2 years into treatment. Stage 3, the kind of treatment that has a cost attached to every week, and the kind of debt that follows a family past the funeral. Nothing moved in the room. You want me to say I sold you? Fine, I sold you. She got 18 more months and she got them without dying in debt. And if you want to hear that, I'd do it differently. He stopped, swallowed something. I've had 6 years to work through that question. I don't have an answer that satisfies me. I don't think there is one. Anthony stood in the middle of the duplex with the photocopy on the table between them. Would you say any of it under oath? The report, the recording. Victor shook his head once. The agreement he'd signed would strip him of everything that remained if he opened his mouth before a state board. He had a family now, a life that had been rebuilt in the years since, carefully, in the space left by what he'd done. Then he said the thing that closed the room. Nobody believes a piece of paper from a man who won't stand behind it. You know that. He was right. That was the worst part. He was exactly right, and they both knew it, and standing there knowing it together was its own particular kind of damage. Anthony picked up the photocopy, put it back in his jacket. He looked at Victor for one more moment, not to communicate anything specific, just to complete the record of the visit, to let the fact of his presence here land before he took it away. He left. He drove home in the same radio-off silence. Except this silence had a different quality. The first one had been the silence of tilt, of a conversation that had shifted in his favor. This one was the silence of closed doors. Victor's closed. The original maintenance log destroyed 8 weeks after the 14th of March. The photocopy real but unauthenticated. A woman on the 12th floor who could testify to everything, and whose testimony would testimony of front of a capable attorney without a single contemporaneous record to support it. A piece of paper from a man who won't stand behind it. He had the carbon sheet. He had the picture on the back. He had a forged signature on a document he'd never signed, and he had the word of a CEO who had participated in building the file that erased him. And he had 5 days until a hearing he'd be walking into alone. Brandon was home when he got there. He could hear music from behind the closed bedroom door, the specific volume of someone who wanted background, not isolation. Anthony heated water for coffee. He actually intended to drink this time, and stood at the counter and looked at the notes he'd made on a yellow legal pad over the past 9 days. The legal pad looked like something was being built on it, or dismantled. Hard to tell from the outside which. He called the one attorney he'd found who handled licensing board appeals. The consultation alone, just the sitting down, just the 1 hour ran more than his half of the rent. He already knew that. He'd looked it up the same night the licensing board letter arrived, the same night he'd decided not to go. He stared at the number on the screen. He closed the contact. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the yellow legal pad and thought about what Vanessa Carter had not said when he told her she should be afraid. The way she'd held the sentence. Not defended against it, not pivoted away from it, just absorbed it and let it stand. That was the thing that kept returning. She hadn't denied wanting something from him. She hadn't pretended the 90 days was about his benefit, rather than the 4,000 patients and the disbursements schedule. But she'd also said it plainly, without the corporate cushioning, without the wealth-insulated instinct to make the ask feel like a gift. She'd said, "I'm asking, and I know I have no standing to ask." He didn't know what to do with that. It didn't change the arithmetic, but it changed something smaller, the texture of the thing, the particular quality of the position he was in. The pressure started 4 days later, and never came from anywhere he could point at directly. That was the craft of it. The 9th Street Diner's contract with Ashford Memorial, the overnight catering account, for the night count, trays for the night staff, a standing order that came through at 4 in the morning and had been coming through for 11 years was not renewed. The letter cited consolidation of vendor relationships. Terry showed it to Anthony at the back near the kitchen, holding it at arm's length, the way he always did it when his reading glasses were in the truck. And neither of them said the obvious thing out loud. Terry cut him from 5 nights to 3. He said it in the parking lot after closing, not inside, which meant he'd been thinking about how to do it for at least a shift. He apologized twice while he did it and looked at the pavement both times. Anthony told him it was fine. 3 nights did not make the rent. 2 days after the contract letter, a post went up on the 9th Street neighborhood page. No name attached. It said that the waiter who worked table 6 at the corner diner had once been an ambulance medic, that a woman had died in the back of his vehicle, that the state had revoked his license for it, that people ought to know who was handling their food. Every word was technically true. That was the craft. By the weekend, 2 of his regulars had moved to the other servers section. He watched it happen with the specific quality of attention of someone who has spent 4 years learning which details register and which ones don't. The table, the direction of the chair, the not quite eye contact as they settled somewhere else. A man he had served 300 times steak and eggs. Tuesday nights. Always the same. Always the booth by the wall came in on a Wednesday and sat at the counter instead. He asked, not unkindly, whether any of what was going around online was true. "A woman died," Anthony said. The man looked at his coffee. "Huh. He moved a stool down. Anthony worked the rest of that shift. He didn't say anything to Terry. Terry had seen the post. He'd seen it before Anthony had, almost certainly, and had not brought it up, which was its own form of communication. The kind that said, I know, and I'm not asking, and I need you to not make me choose. Brandon came home from a friend's place that Friday with a quiet that had a specific shape. He came in, put his jacket on the hook, went to the refrigerator, looked into it without taking anything, closed it, stood with his back to Anthony for a moment. Is it true? His voice was the voice of someone who had already decided something and was checking the decision against the source. Anthony looked at his son's back, because this was the moment, the one he'd been navigating around for 6 years. The question asked straight, in the kitchen, at whatever o'clock in the afternoon, by a person who had a right to the answer, and who would carry whatever answer he received for the rest of his adult life. A woman died, Anthony said, on my unit. 6 years ago. Brandon turned around. His expression was not accusatory. It was the expression of someone listening who has already cleared space for whatever comes next. Was it your fault? And there it was. The thing he'd never said out loud. Not in the hearing room, not in the dark kitchen at 4 a.m. Not to Stephanie Harris when she'd come close enough to ask. The question with the hole in the middle of it. I don't know, Anthony said. Because that was the truth. Not the clean version, not the exculpatory version, not the version where the forged signature and the out-of-certification monitor made him simply and entirely innocent. The true version. The one with the ragged edges. The machine I was using was giving me numbers that weren't reliable. I didn't know that. Nobody told me, but I was there. And she died. And I've spent 6 years going over that night, and I still can't tell you with total certainty that a better person would have seen it differently. Brandon looked at him for a long moment. Then, okay, just that. He went to his room. Anthony stood at the kitchen counter, with his hands flat on the surface, not gripping, just resting there, and thought about the word okay, and what it contained, and what it cost an 18-year-old to say it. The attorney's office was in Midtown, 15th floor, the kind of building that communicated through its lobby that the services inside were not for everyone. Anthony sat in the waiting area on a Tuesday morning 3 days before the hearing, in his one good jacket with the carbon sheet in a manila envelope on his knee, and thought about the consultation fee and the rent and the cut from 5 nights to 3. The attorney's name was on a door in frosted glass. He came out at exactly the scheduled time. A trim man in his mid-50s, with the quality of attention of someone who charged by the hour, and had decided long ago that his attentiveness was part of the product. They sat. Anthony explained the situation. The revocation, the 6 years, the maintenance failure, the carbon sheet, the forged signature, the hearing in 3 days. The attorney listened without writing anything down, which Anthony found either impressive or concerning. When Anthony finished, the attorney asked one question. Who else can corroborate the equipment failure at the time of the incident? My former partner. He reported it before the shift. He has a recording. He won't come forward. The attorney nodded slowly. And the woman at the hospital, the CEO, she'll testify. But she admits she's the one who participated in building the review. Without the maintenance log, which was destroyed, she's a motivated witness with criminal exposure testifying to her own culpability in order to clear someone else. The attorney finished the sentence without editorializing. I've seen that argument survive. I've seen it not survive. It depends on the panel, the documentation, and the credibility of the person presenting their own account. He paused. What do you have for your own account? Anthony took the carbon sheet out of the envelope. The attorney looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the front, the circled notation, the handwriting that was not Anthony's. He turned it over and looked at the back, at the drawing, at the 4 large careful letters. He set it down. 3 days, he said. 3 days. The attorney looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not dramatically, the way a man looks at the ceiling when he is calculating something honest. I'll need the original sheet, all documentation you can produce about the licensing board notification, any communications you've received from Ashford Medical, or their attorneys, and a full written account of the events of that evening from your own memory. He paused. My fee for the preparation and representation at the hearing is not something I can reduce. I can offer a payment schedule. He named the number. Anthony sat with the number. It was the number he'd already looked up. The same number he'd found the night the letter arrived. The same number that had contributed to the decision not to go in the first place. The payment schedule made the monthly amount possible. It made the total amount, spread over time, the kind of debt that reorganizes the next year of a person's life. He said he would think about it. He took the carbon sheet back. He went home. The offer came the day before the hearing. Not from Vanessa Carter. From Ashford Medical's attorney, a different person entirely. A man Anthony had not met, who called ahead and arranged a time and showed up at the diner during the slow afternoon window on a Wednesday with a leather portfolio and the manner of someone doing something professionally uncomfortable. He opened by saying that Ashford Memorial deeply regretted the burden the last several years had placed on Mr. Wilson and his family. Anthony let him talk. By the end, the shape was clear. The system was prepared to enter an agreed resolution with the licensing board in place of the contested hearing. Revocation vacated, record expunged, certification restored upon entry of the order, no appearance required. And in recognition of the disruption to his professional and personal life, a settlement, $400,000, in exchange for a full release of claims, confidentiality as to the incident and the review process, and all persons involved, no cooperation with any third-party proceeding. Anthony repeated the last term back slowly. No third-party proceeding, meaning if somebody else raises this, I'm not there. Meaning, the attorney said, that the matter would be closed. The attorney then mentioned one more item almost as a courtesy. The way a person mentions something they want the other party to hear before they hear it elsewhere. There was a name Mr. Wilson should probably be aware of. Dr. Harold Reed, the physician who had chaired the original incident review. Currently in the final confirmation stage for the State Directorship of Emergency Medical Services. Oversight of every ambulance contract in the state. Every protocol revision. Every certification body. Every decision about what equipment standards looked like and who enforced them and what happened when those standards weren't met. The confirmation vote was expected within the month. Anthony said the name back slowly to make sure he had it. Harold Reed. He remembered the voice. Not the face. The hearing room had been arranged in a way that put the panel at a remove, but the voice. Mild, measured. The voice of someone who had decided long ago that the performance of reasonableness was more effective than volume. He remembered the question asked from the far end of the conference table. Did you verify your equipment prior to the run? He remembered his own answer. His partner had done the pre-shift. It had been reported, and Reed's response, the file does not reflect any such report. The file Reed had chaired. The file with the signature Anthony had never written. He told the attorney he needed time. The attorney said the offer had a window. He said it, the way attorneys say things that have windows without specifying the size of the window, which was itself information. He left. Anthony sat at the table 6 in the empty diner. Everyone gone, Terry in the back, and looked at the window where the woman in the camel coat had spent 3 Thursdays watching ambulance doors. The light through that window at this hour was direct and uncompromising. It showed the scratches in the table surface, the tape repair on the vinyl bench, the small inventory of wear that accumulated over years in a place that never closed. $400,000. His son in this apartment, or a better one. Record expunged, not just overturned but gone. As though the hearing had never happened. As though the 14th of March had been filed differently from the start. Certification restored. The professional designation that said he was legally and permanently a man nothing had ever happened to. Against that, a hearing tomorrow morning. No attorney now. The payment arrangement would have required a deposit he'd committed to, and then the offer had arrived, and he'd called and pushed the meeting, which had been a tacit communication he hadn't intended. the carbon sheet with the drawing on the back and Victor's handwriting on the front, which nobody would authenticate. Vanessa Carter, with criminal exposure and no contemporaneous record. And Harold Reed becoming the man who decided what happened to every ambulance in this state. He thought about Latasha Green. The outline he'd constructed of her over 6 years. 44, third floor, chest, pain, 2:07 a.m. And the way that outline had never filled in, because he'd never let himself look for the photograph, never let himself make her particular, because making her particular would have required making the night particular. And making the night particular would have required arriving at the 31 seconds. And the 31 second were where the doubt lived. He was still afraid of what he'd find in the 31 seconds. That was the truth he hadn't said to Brandon when he'd said, "I don't know." The part underneath the "I don't know" was, "I haven't looked because I'm afraid of the answer." He sat at table 6 for a long time. Then he went back to the kitchen and told Terry he'd take the extra shift tomorrow night. If Darnell couldn't cover, he went home. He sat at the kitchen table with the carbon sheet and the manila envelope and the legal pad and did not make a decision for 4 hours. At 9:40 the next morning, the hour she always arrived. The hour that was already written into the week. Like a scheduled appointment, he signed the settlement agreement in the Ashford Medical Attorney's conference room with the good light. 4 minutes. Initialed at each of the small colored tabs. The check was already drawn, already dated, already waiting in the portfolio, the way something prepared for a known conclusion waits. He drove home. He put the check in the dresser drawer under a stack of Brandon's outgrown shirts. And for 2 days he behaved like a man who had solved something. He told Terry he'd be leaving the diner eventually. Watched Terry's face do something complicated between relief and the specific grief of someone losing a person they never had the right words for anyway. He told Stephanie nothing, which was a confession of its own kind. She came to the counter 3 mornings in a row, and he talked about weather, and she accepted it with the particular restraint of someone who knew not to pull on a thread they could see moving. He didn't deposit the check. He told himself it was ordinary caution. You don't spend before the orders entered. He told himself that for 2 days and almost believed it. The release carried a 7-day revocation period. 1 paragraph, small type, page 9, the kind of clause included because the law required it. Until that clock ran out, a man could change his mind. He had read that paragraph 4 times. He was only being thorough. On the second night at 2:10 in the morning, someone knocked on his door. Stephanie Harris, still in her scrubs. She had not driven home first. She had come straight from the floor, carrying something she could not set down, and she started talking before she was fully inside. A patient had come through the bay at 11:40 the previous night. Cardiac, transported under the same fleet contract, treated in the back of a rig the crew had every reason to trust, reading a monitor the way you're trained to read a monitor, making decisions off numbers that looked like numbers, the way numbers look when nobody has told you they're not reliable. The man had died in the corridor outside the elevators. The crew had done nothing wrong. And by 6 that morning, the incident already had an internal review number. They pulled the unit log. Stephanie's knuckles went white around the strap of her bag. I watched the tech pull it. Anthony, the equipment was out of certification. 14 months. He stood in his own doorway and felt the floor move. Not the way it had moved in Vanessa Carter's office, not the tilt of leverage, not the shift toward him. The other direction. The direction that meant everything he had been carefully balancing had just been placed on the wrong side of the scale. 14 months. There's no cross-check, she said. The pre-shift verification still goes up to a supervisor and stops. Nobody built a second signature into it. Nobody built anything. 6 years in the same hole is in the same place in the same building. Of course it was. He understood it in one breath. You cannot quietly add a safeguard to a system while insisting the system was never at fault. The safeguard becomes evidence. If the pre-shift verification had been redesigned, if a second signature had been required, if an independent confirmation line had been added outside the supervisory chain, That redesign was proof that the original design had failed. And if the original design had failed, then the question of why it had failed and who had known it had failed became an open question. The hole had been left open on purpose. And for 6 years, the arrangement had worked, because the arrangement had a name attached to it. Anthony Wilson. The name in the crew acknowledgement box. The name that said the system didn't fail, a person failed. Specifically, this person. Right here. He'll be the one who decides whether the hole ever gets closed, Stephanie said. Read. He's the reason it's open. She left at 3:20. Anthony sat at the kitchen table with the light off. 5 days remained on the revocation window. 3 of them were already gone. If he revoked, called the attorney in the morning, exercised the clause on page 9, pulled back the signed agreement, he lost $400,000 and the reinstatement that came with it. He walked into a hearing in 2 days with no attorney and no witness. And a carbon sheet nobody would authenticate. The health system would bury him in filings. His son would grow up with a father who had been offered everything and had chosen, out of some private idea about himself, to have nothing. If he stayed quiet, he kept all of it. The certification, the money, the record that showed a man nothing had ever happened to. And in some month, he couldn't predict, a third name would go on a form. He sat in the dark a long time. Around 4 in the morning, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Vanessa Carter sounded like someone speaking from the bottom of a long illness. The board had removed her from her seat. Her holdings had been placed in a voting trust she no longer controlled. The charitable fund had frozen the previous week, not because she'd testified, but because the partners in the incoming transaction had gone looking for legal exposure and had found her sitting on top of it. 82 days, she said. I asked you for 90, and I didn't get 82. The disbursement never cleared, so I spent 6 years buying something, and it turns out I never owned it. He asked, because he had to, had she known about the man who died 2 nights ago. I found out this morning from a nurse's post, like everyone else. Her voice shifted, quieter but not softer. I want to say one thing and then I'm going to hang up because I don't want to hear what you say back to me. He waited. I stayed silent for 6 years, and I did the arithmetic every single day. 4,000 people against 1. I got very good at it. I could do it in my sleep and it always came out the same. A pause that had more inside it than pauses usually hold. I can't remember her face. He didn't say anything. I looked at her photograph 100 times in that review file. Latasha Green. I could have told you the color of her front door. And somewhere in the last several years she turned into a number inside a sum, and now, when I reach for her, I get nothing at all. That's what the arithmetic costs. Not your license, mine. The call ended. Outside, 9th Street was empty and wet. He sat with the phone in his hand until the screen went dark. 2 days. He woke Brandon early. No explanation. Just, get up. Breakfast is happening. Come to the kitchen. The kind of sentence that in their household meant something was shifting, but hadn't found its words yet. And Brandon, who had learned to read the weather of his father, the way you learn the particular vocabulary of a house you've lived in. Long enough, the specific creak, the specific silence came out in a sweatshirt and sat at the table without asking. Anthony made pancakes. Badly. The way he always made them, which Brandon had once described as geologically significant, which Anthony had taken as the compliment it was. The first 2 came out too dark on one side and pale on the other, uneven in a way that suggested the cook was present in body, but somewhere else in every other measurable sense. He put them on the plate anyway. He went to the bedroom, opened the dresser drawer, moved the stack of Brandon's outgrown shirts, the ones he'd never thrown away. Because throwing them away required deciding they were gone, and he hadn't been ready for that, not specifically, not yet. Under the shirts, the check, still there, still undeposited, folded in thirds, the way it had come out of the portfolio 2 days ago in the conference room with the good light. He carried it back to the kitchen, set it on the table between the syrup bottle and Brandon's glass of milk, sat down. Brandon looked at the check, looked at his father. His expression did not perform a reaction. It simply received the information and waited for context the way faces do when the person behind them has decided to be patient. Is that money? Yes. How much? Enough to be a real problem. Don't touch the syrup yet. Sit still a minute. Anthony picked up the check, held it with both hands, and tore it in half. The sound of it was smaller than he expected. Paper tearing is a small sound. It shouldn't land the way it did. He tore each half in half again and set the 4 pieces in the middle of the table between them, arranged like something served, like something that had been prepared and was now being presented and could not be taken back to the kitchen. Brandon looked at the pieces, then up. Boy, what did you sit still? Not harsh, but definite. I'm going to tell you about the 14th of March. All of it. Some of it's going to be boring and some of it won't. I need you to let me get through both kinds. Brandon sat back, and Anthony told it. Not the careful version. Not the available version. The one with the edges smoothed down to something a kid could carry. The full version. He started at the beginning. The dispatch at 2:07. The unit number. Victor Bryant in the passenger seat. The building on Clifton. The 3rd floor. Landing. The position he'd found Latasha Green in. The way her color was wrong in the ambient light of the corridor. He gave Brandon the clinical sequence, the assessment, the monitor reading, the 31 seconds he'd spent trying to reconcile what the machine was showing him with what the woman in front of him was telling him with her body. He used vocabulary he hadn't spoken aloud in 6 years, and it came back whole, like a language. Like something that had been stored rather than lost. Then he told Brandon about the maintenance failure, the calibration expiration, the 91 days. The fact that the numbers on that monitor could not be defended after the fact because nobody in the supervisory chain had been willing to defend them before the fact, and nobody had told the crew. He told him about the review, the forged signature, the file that said crew acknowledgement in a hand Anthony had never lifted. He told him about the shoebox, about finding the carbon sheet at 1:17 in the morning on the bedroom floor, the circled notation in Victor's handwriting, and the specific quality of stillness that hit him when he turned the sheet over and saw what was on the other side. He didn't describe the drawing in detail. Brandon knew the drawing. Brandon had drawn it, some rainy afternoon he probably didn't remember anymore, on a yellow sheet he'd found in a box under a bed. Then Anthony told the part he had never said to anyone. Not Stephanie. Not Vanessa Carter. Not the walls at 4 in the morning, which had heard most of what he'd swallowed over the years. For 6 years I believed that report a little. Not all of it. I never believed all of it. But a little, because I was there, and she died, and I've run that night through my head more times than I can count, and I still can't tell you with certainty that the machine being wrong was the only variable. I was 29. I made decisions based on what I had. And I've spent 6 years not being able to fully close the question of whether a better person would have caught something I missed. He looked at his son. I want you to know I'm telling you the truth, and the truth has a hole in the middle of it. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. Brandon was quiet for a moment that had weight. Then he got up. He went to his room without saying anything, which, for approximately 4 seconds, felt like the worst possible response. Then he came back. He had the Lost Things notebook. He sat down, opened it to a blank page near the back, and wrote something with his hand curved around it in that private way, closed the notebook, put it in his backpack which was hanging on the chair behind him. He looked up. Are there more pancakes? The ones on your plate are still technically food. Technically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Anthony got up and made 2 more. Burned one completely. The other came out almost right, which by his standards was exceptional. Brandon ate without speaking and without needing to. And that silence, that particular, deliberate, chosen silence from an 18-year-old who had just been handed 6 years of compressed information and had responded by asking for pancakes, was the most adult thing Anthony had ever watched another person do. He called the licensing board at 9 a.m. The number was still programmed into his phone from 9 days ago, the night he'd opened the board's letter, and then not called, and then not called, and then not called until now. He waited through the automated system. Got a person, stated his name and his case number. He said he was exercising the revocation clause on his signed settlement agreement. He said it once. The person on the other end asked him to repeat it, which was either confusion or protocol. He repeated it. The person told him to hold. He held. He thought about the clause on page 9, the small type, the 7-day window, written into the agreement because the law required it, the kind of provision that exists in legal documents, the way exit doors exist in buildings, structurally required, technically accessible, and in practice almost never used. He was using it. The person came back, confirmed the revocation, confirmed that the hearing remained on the calendar for 9 a.m. the following Thursday, confirmed that Mr. Wilson would receive updated paperwork within 24 hours, said, in the flat voice of institutional procedures being fulfilled, that she hoped his matter resolved favorably. He said thank you. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table, with the phone on the table in front of him, and thought about the 4 pieces of the check still in the middle of the table, because Brandon had left them there. Had not swept them up, had not thrown them away, had left them there like a deliberate thing, the pieces arranged in roughly the same configuration where they'd landed. He thought about what that meant. He decided it meant his son had understood something important and had chosen to acknowledge it in the way that felt right to him, which was to leave the evidence where it was. Anthony stacked the pieces on top of each other, put them in his jacket pocket. He wasn't throwing them away either. He wasn't sure why. It seemed important to have them somewhere close. To be able to put his hand in his pocket and feel the edges. The next 4 days were their own kind of weather. No attorney. He had made that decision implicitly when he'd pushed the meeting, and explicitly when he'd revoked the settlement. And he sat with it without revisiting it, because revisiting decisions after they're made is a particular type of cruelty you can inflict on yourself, and he had enough else to carry. He spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table with the legal pad, writing. Not an argument, not a speech. He tried a speech on the second night, and listened to it come out of his own mouth in the kitchen at 3 a.m., and heard immediately what was wrong with it. It heard the same hollow thing his words had heard in the hearing 6 years ago, the sound of a man trying to be believed, rather than the sound of a man telling what he knew. He threw the draft away. What he wrote instead was sequence, mechanics. The way you describe a scene you were actually present in, to someone who wasn't. Time of dispatch, response interval, distance, the 3rd floor, landing, the ambient light, the position of the body, the specific quality of the color wrong in the face that had triggered the assessment before he'd consciously decided to begin. 1. The reading on the monitor, the 31 seconds. The second decision, the one he'd made, when the numbers stopped agreeing with the woman in front of him. The adjustment, the recalibration, the doing of the thing that was available to be done with the tools and time and information he had. He wrote it without argument, without the word unfair, without the framing of what had been done to him. Just the sequence of what had happened, in order, the way a person who was actually there would describe it. When he read it back the next morning, it sounded like something true. That was the test he'd found for it. Not convincing. True. He called Stephanie. She picked up on the second ring. He heard background noise, the particular frequency of a hospital corridor, which he recognized before she said anything. I'm going to the hearing Thursday, he said. A pause. Okay. I don't have an attorney. Okay. I have the carbon sheet. I have the drawing on the back. I have what I remember about the night. And me. She said it like it wasn't a decision being made, like it was a fact, being stated that had been true for a while and was now just being confirmed. I go off at 7. The hearing's at 9. I'll be there. You don't have to. Anthony. Her voice had that quality. The one that made you sit up straight before you knew it was happening. I've been watching that unit log problem for 3 years. I know what that certification date said on the equipment that came in. Monday night. If there is a room where someone is going to hear that information, I want to be the person who says it. He didn't argue. They hung up. He thought about the particular kind of person who shows up not because they're asked, but because they've already decided the asking is implied. The kind of person who treats the right thing like a scheduled appointment they've had on the calendar. For a while, he thought about Stephanie Harris and her 3 years of watching a log and saying nothing in the absence of a place to say it. And now there was a place. He sat with that. Then he went to write down the rest of the sequence. The 31 seconds. The second decision. The hand he had been holding when the unit came through the bay doors. He wrote it all the way through, to the end, for the first time. Thursday morning arrived the way significant mornings do, indistinguishable from the outside. Same light, same street sounds, same radiator knock in the hallway. The kind of day that only becomes the day it is in retrospect. Anthony dressed without ceremony. The one good jacket, the manila envelope with the original carbon sheet, and a copy in a separate envelope because 6 years had made him a man who made copies. He had not eaten. He had made coffee badly and drunk most of it, and left the rest cooling in the cup. Brandon was still asleep, which was correct. This was not Brandon's day to carry, it was Anthony's day to carry, and part of what the last 2 mornings had rebuilt between them was the specific understanding that some things belong to the person doing them, and the support of the person who loves them looks like trust, not company. He left a note on the table. Not long. Something about dinner. He took the 4 pieces of the check out of his jacket pocket and looked at them for a moment. Then he put them back. He walked to the state office building on Central Avenue, which was 22 blocks, and took 31 minutes, which he knew because he timed it. He had wanted to walk. He had wanted the distance to exist in his body before he sat in a room and asked a panel of strangers to read 6 years of institutional language and find the place where it went wrong. The building was exactly what it was: fluorescent lights, a security desk, a bulletin board near the elevator with layered notices in plastic sleeves. Not a courthouse. Not a place built for drama. A place built for procedures, for the ordinary business of licenses and permits, and the filing of things that needed to be filed. He signed in. He went up. The hearing room had 11 chairs and a rectangular table and a public gallery of 6 seats along the far wall. 4 of those seats were empty. Stephanie Harris was in the 5th, wearing her scrubs, with the particular quality of someone who has been awake since yesterday, and has decided that this is the context in which they're going to spend their last 4 hours of useful energy. Their eyes met. She nodded once. He sat at the table. The panel took their seats, 5 people, 3 of whom appeared to be physicians, 1 a registered nurse, 1 whose professional background Anthony couldn't read from the badge angle. The chair of the panel was a woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck and the expression of someone who had presided over enough of these to have arrived at a stable opinion of human nature. Counsel for Ashford Medical was at the opposite table, a different attorney than the one Anthony had met, older, sharper around the eyes, the kind of man who had been in these rooms before and had won in these rooms before, and was calibrating his assessment of this particular situation in real time. The chair called the session to order. Anthony opened the manila envelope. He placed 1 page on the table in front of him. The carbon sheet, soft yellow, the texture of old cloth, Victor Bryant's handwriting in 2 columns. Every line item checked in sequence down the left side of the form. At the bottom section, the cardiac monitor and defibrillator notation. Calibration date. The circled annotation in blue ink, pressed hard, circled twice with the deliberateness of someone who understood they were creating a record that mattered. Out of cert. Reported to SUPV. He turned the sheet over, set it face down on the table so the panel could see the reverse side. The drawing. The person in the dark uniform with 1 arm raised. The boxy white shape with the stripe and the wheels. The 4 large letters underneath, careful and enormous and mise, and written by a child who had not known what he was writing on. Dad. The room was quiet. That's why no one has ever seen this document. His voice came out level, the way it used to come out on calls. It sat in a shoebox under my bed for 6 years. My son found the blank side of it and used it. I'm telling you the embarrassing version now, because I'd rather do that than let someone else tell a worse one later. The panel chair looked at the sheet for a moment. Then, at Anthony, he began, not with the injustice, not with the forged signature, not with the system failure, not with the 6 years. He began with the dispatch at 2:07 a.m. on the 14th of March. He gave them the response interval, the address, the floor, the ambient conditions of the third-floor landing. He described the position of the patient with the precision of someone who had stood in that specific geometry and who could reconstruct it without notes. He gave them the assessment, the monitor reading. He gave them the specific number, not the range. The number, the exact figure that had appeared on the screen that he had read and used to make a decision. He told them what decision he made and why he made it, and what information he had and did not have at the moment of making it. He gave them the 31 seconds. He described them the way a person describes something they have been over 1,000 times, not fluently, not smoothly, but with the particular texture of deeply familiar terrain, the thing his body knew even when his mind was still processing. The second decision, the one where the numbers on the screen and the woman on the floor stopped matching, the recalibration, the adjustment to protocol, the continued effort in the back of a moving vehicle in the dark. He did not ask them to find him innocent. He asked them to look at the sequence. Somewhere in the middle of it, the panel chair stopped writing on her notepad. She set the pen down and looked at him, without the performance of neutrality that people wear in official settings. She just listened, because it had become plain. In the specific way things become plain when they are true, and the person saying them was actually present, that the man at the table had been in the back of that ambulance and no document could replicate what that sounded like. He finished. The room held the silence for a moment. Then the panel chair said, "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We'll hear from Miss Harris." Stephanie walked to the table without hurrying. She described the patient admitted Monday night with the thoroughness of someone who has spent 7 years documenting things for audiences that needed the details in order. Cardiac presentation, transport under the Ashford Fleet contract. She described the condition of the patient on arrival and the interventions attempted and the outcome in the corridor outside the elevators. She described requesting the unit log and the notation she found there. 14 months. She said the number plainly, not for effect, because it was the number. She said that in 7 years at Ashford Memorial, the pre-shift verification form had not been revised once. She said she had checked that morning, at 6:15, before coming here. She said the form that existed today was structurally identical to the form that had existed on the night of the 14th of March. Counsel for Ashford Medical rose, objected on relevance. The panel chair overruled him in 4 words. "Sit down, please, counselor." He sat. The door at the back of the room opened at 11:40. It opened without announcement, without a knock, without the particular sound of someone who had been granted permission and was now using it. The sound of someone who had made a decision, enacting, and was now enacting it, which has its own distinct quality. Vanessa Carter came in without the camel coat. She wore a gray blazer over a dark top, a narrow scarf at her throat, shoes that had been walked in seriously. She looked like someone who had lost something recently and had recalibrated around the loss, smaller in a way that had nothing to do with size. The silver hair was the same precise cut. The face was the same face sharp, direct, not asking for anything from the room. She asked the panel's permission to be sworn in. The panel chair looked at her for a moment. Then, "You may approach." She was sworn. She identified herself, her name, her former title, her relationship to Ashford Medical Group. The particular word "former" landed with weight in the room. She did not wait for a question. 6 years ago, I was informed of a fleet maintenance failure that left multiple units in the Ashford contract, fleet operating with cardiac monitoring equipment outside its calibration certification. I participated in the decision not to disclose that failure during a pending merger transaction. I approved the construction of an internal incident review that assigned the operational failure to the transporting crew of Unit 9, and I was aware at the time that the crew acknowledgement signature on that review document had not been executed by Mr. Wilson. counsel for Ashford Medical was on his feet. The panel chair pointed at him without looking. He sat. Vanessa continued. She gave them the name of the physician who had chaired the review. Dr. Harold Reed. She gave them the date of the retention schedule. Revision, 8 weeks. After the 14th of March that had resulted in the destruction of the fleet maintenance log. She gave them the internal reference number of the memorandum, authorizing that revision, which she had committed to memory, because she had been the one to sign it, and because some things you carry whether you want to or not. The panel chair leaned forward. Miss Carter, are you aware that this statement exposes you to potential criminal referral? Yes. And you're making it without anything being offered to me? Yes. She held the panel chair's gaze with the steadiness of someone who has already paid the price of the thing they're doing, and is simply completing the transaction, and nothing was ever offered to Mr. Wilson. I want that on record. Whatever else is in this file, the record should reflect that he never took anything from Ashford Medical, not because he wasn't offered it, because he refused it. A pause, not for drama, for accuracy. That was the only thing I managed to get right. She did not look at Anthony during any of it. He understood why. Looking at him would have made it about what she needed from the room. And she wasn't here for that. Whatever she was here for, it was not absolution from him, and the decision not to seek it while it was available was the most honest thing he had seen her do. The panel recessed at 12:40. Anthony stood in the corridor with a cup of water from the dispenser near the bathrooms and thought about nothing in particular. Not nothing as a strategy, nothing as a natural condition of a man who has said everything he has to say and is now waiting for the world to process it. Stephanie stood beside him. She had her jacket over her arm, and she was eating a granola bar from her bag with the methodical efficiency of someone who has learned to eat at any available opportunity, because the next available opportunity is never guaranteed. How do you feel? She asked it without looking at him. Pragmatic. Strange. Strange good or strange like you left the stove on. Strange like both of those might be the same thing right now. She finished the granola bar, folded the wrapper precisely, put it in her jacket pocket. For what it's worth, the way you described that night. The sequence. She paused. That's what it sounds like when someone was actually there. He looked at the wall across the corridor. Institutional paint. The specific beige of places that expect to exist a long time. I still don't know, he said. The 31 seconds. I've been over it 6 years and I still don't know if I know her. Voice was not soft. It was clear. That's not weakness. That's honest. A person who was certain after 6 years of thinking about it would be the problem, not you. He thought about that. At 2:20 in the afternoon, a courier arrived at the clerk's station at the far end of the corridor. Anthony watched from where he stood. The courier handed an envelope to the clerk. No return address. The clerk looked at it, looked at the room number written on the front, and walked it into the hearing room. Anthony could see through the open door. The clerk handing it to the panel chair's assistant, the assistant handing it to the chair. The chair's expression did not change in any dramatic way. She simply looked at the envelope for a moment, then opened it, then looked at what was inside. Then she called the hearing back to session. Anthony went back in. The panel chair set a small device on the table, the kind used in these rooms for audio playback of recorded evidence, standard equipment, nothing theatrical about it. She stated for the record that an anonymous submission had been received during the recess. She stated its format. She stated that the panel would hear the content and that counsel for both parties would have the opportunity to address it. She pressed play. The audio was clear enough. Some compression from age, from whatever medium it had lived in for 6 years, but clear. A telephone line, the specific audio texture of a recorded institutional call. A timestamp, stated at the top of the recording by an automated system. 14th of March, 1:09 a.m. 1 hour and 9 minutes before dispatch. A voice, young, male, slightly tight in the register of someone reporting something they are not certain will be received well, reading a unit number, reading a calibration date from what sounded like a sticker being read aloud. saying, "I'm looking at the monitor and defibrillator on Unit 9, and the cert date is 91 days expired. What do I do with that?" A second voice, older, settled, the voice of someone who had been in this position before, and had learned how to inhabit authority without having to earn it fresh each time. Mild, precise. The voice Anthony had last heard at the far end of a conference table 6 years ago, asking whether he had verified his equipment, log it and run the shift. The recording ended. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then counsel for Ashford Medical rose, and to his credit he did not object first. He asked who had submitted it, which was the right question. The panel chair said the submission was anonymous, and that the chain of custody was being established. He asked about authentication. She said that would be addressed. He sat. Anthony stood at the back of the room with his arms folded, because this was Victor. Not Victor in the room. Not Victor on record. Not Victor with his name attached to anything that would trigger the agreement he'd signed and take what he had left. But Victor with the recording he'd kept for 6 years. The one he'd told Anthony he had. The one he'd said he couldn't use, except he had used it at a distance, unsigned, through a courier who would not remember the address they'd picked it up from, if they'd been given one at all. The debt paid in a way that cost him what he could afford to spend and protected what he could not afford to lose. Anthony thought about what he'd said in the duplex. Nobody believes a piece of paper from a man who won't stand behind it. He'd been right about that. He was still right about it. But he had done the thing he could do, in the way he could do it, and that was a different kind of standing behind something than the kind that required a signature. Not forgiveness. It was not the right word for what this was, but it was the closest thing that was going to exist. And Anthony, standing at the back of the room with his arms folded and 6 years of a particular silence finally running out of weight, understood that some debts get paid in the only currency available, and that receiving the payment without naming the source was itself a form of respect for the cost. The confirmation vote on Harold Reed's Stefate directorship was pulled from the calendar the following morning. Anthony found out from a news notification on his phone while he was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was, for once, the correct temperature. He read the headline twice. Not because he didn't believe it. Because reading something twice when it matters is the reasonable response. Reed suspended from clinical and administrative duties pending a joint investigation. The State Licensing Board and the Office of the Attorney General acting jointly. Timeline not specified. The particular language of an investigation that had been opened and would now take the time it took. He set the phone down. Brandon came out of his room at 9:15 and poured cereal and sat at the table and saw his father's face. Good news? Strange news. Strange good. Yeah. Anthony turned the cup in his hands. Strange good. Brandon ate cereal and asked nothing else, which was correct. Some mornings the information announces itself in the face, and the person at the table trusts the announcement. 11 days later, the revocation of Anthony Wilson's emergency medical technician certification was vacated in full. The order came with a finding, not just a decision. A finding, which is a different thing. A finding said, not merely resolved in your favor, but resolved with a determination about what was true. The finding stated that the original incident review had been materially false in its assignment of responsibility, that the crew acknowledgement had not been executed by the named party, that the administrative failures preceding the incident of the 14th of March had been known at the supervisory level and had not been disclosed to the operating crew. Certification restored upon entry of the order. He called the number on the letter to confirm it was real. The woman who answered confirmed it. He thanked her. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about the specific quality of a weight being removed. Not the relief of it, which he'd expected, but the strange physical disorientation of carrying something so long that the absence of it changes your posture. He was standing differently. He noticed that. He didn't quite know what to do with himself for a few days. The Ashford medical attorney called twice. The first time, Anthony let it go to voicemail. The message was professional. The number had grown. The second time, He picked up and let the man state the figure, and then said, without elaboration, he had learned what that particular transaction cost, and he had decided against it. The attorney asked if he wanted to discuss the terms. He said no. The attorney said he understood and that the offer would remain open through the end of the week. Anthony said he hoped the rest of the week was productive for him. He hung up. Stephanie called that afternoon, and he told her. She said good, which was the word she used for things that were more than good, but that she wasn't going to perform about. He understood. He used the same word. He spent a week doing very little, which is not the same as doing nothing. Doing very little has its own texture, the intentional vacancy of a person letting something settle before they start building on top of it. He ate breakfast with Brandon. He took long walks on routes he'd been running for 4 years without noticing what was on them. He sat with the question of what came next, and let it remain a question instead of immediately trying to produce an answer. What came next was community health. He found the posting through the county health department website on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week. A position with the community care unit, a county van, a rotating route through the residential buildings east of 9th Street, visiting patients with long-course conditions who couldn't get to a clinic, diabetes management, blood pressure monitoring, medication adherence, transport arrangement. For those whose conditions required in-person care they could no longer access independently. Not a night rig, not a dispatch, not a trauma rotation, not the particular compressed intensity of emergency response that had been the shape of his professional life for 4 years before the 14th of March. Daytime hours, a route, a list of names and addresses and conditions that he would come to know the way you come to know the contents of your own refrigerator, specific, familiar, with a clear sense of what needed attention and what was stable. He applied on a Thursday. He was hired 2 weeks later. The interview had been 17 minutes. The woman conducting it had asked about his certification history, with the directness of someone who had read the order, and was including the question for procedural completeness, rather than because she needed the answer. Your certification was vacated on what grounds? She had asked it while making a note on her pad, a finding that the original review was materially false. He'd said it the way the order said it. Administrative failure not disclosed to the operating crew. She'd looked at him for a moment, made another note. When can you start? 3 weeks from Monday, as it turned out. He told Terry the Tuesday before. They were in the parking lot again. Same configuration as the last conversation outside. After closing, the particular privacy of the empty lot and the residual warmth of the evening, Terry listened with his hands in his jacket pockets, which was his posture for receiving information he'd already partly anticipated. Community health, Terry said. Route out of the county annex, east of 9th. Terry nodded. He looked at the diner sign, the orange-yellow that never went out, still burning on its corner, still promising whatever it promised to whoever needed it at whatever hour. He was quiet for a moment. You're keeping a shift? He asked it without making it a request. 1 a month. Anthony said it without making it a concession. Thursdays. Terry looked at him. Because you gave me work for 4 years without asking a single question, Anthony said. And because I discovered I don't want to be the kind of man who leaves a place the moment leaving becomes possible. Terry looked back at the sign. Thursdays, he said. Thursdays. They stood there a moment in the parking lot in the residual warmth. He was home for dinner every night. That was the first thing Brandon said about it. Not about the job itself, not about what it meant or represented, but about the dinner part. Every night. The observation delivered with a deliberate casualness that Anthony recognized as the same technique Brandon used in the Lost Things notebook, the way you record something significant by describing it simply, without ceremony, as though the significance is too large to be dressed up. Every night at the table. Dinner that never notably improved. The pasta approximations, the rice that came out in configurations, the occasional ambitious attempt at something involving actual vegetables, that resulted in outcomes he would not have served to anyone outside the apartment, but that Brandon ate without comment, and sometimes for thirds, which Anthony took as both a compliment and evidence that his son had a higher tolerance for culinary experimentation than he let on. They talked at those dinners. Not always about things that mattered, more often about the lost things notebook, which had continued filling up a boot found at the bottom of the park hill, a paperback with someone's name written in pencil on the inside cover and 4 pages dog-eared in sequence. Brandon had developed theories about the paperback's previous owner that spanned 7 pages of the notebook and included a timeline that Anthony had listened to across 3 separate dinners without once suggesting it might be overbuilt. He kept 1 shift a month at the diner, always a Thursday. He had a regular now at the counter, a man who came in at 9:30 and ordered the same thing every week and tipped exactly 20% with the consistency of someone who had made a decision about it once and found it sufficient. He poured coffee for nurses he now knew by name. In a different context, he had been in their patients' homes, had sat at kitchen tables across from people they were trying to keep stable, and the nurses who ate at his counter had a different shape in his understanding of the world than they had before. Stephanie came in on the 3rd Thursday and sat at the counter and didn't order anything, just took the coffee he'd already poured and held it in both hands. "How's the root?" she asked. "Good. Strange good. Or just good." He refilled her cup. "A woman on Claremont has a dog that tries to bite me every visit. But she's 81 and the dog is 11 and neither of them is going to change so." Stephanie smiled at her cup. "That's practically a love story. I think of it more as a contract negotiation." She drank her coffee. He cleared a table. It was on a Thursday in late February that Vanessa Carter came back. He saw her through the window from 3 tables away and recognized the walk before he registered the coat, or rather the absence of the coat, which was information. She was wearing something gray and plain, a scarf he hadn't seen before, shoes that looked like shoes that got used. No fur. The arraignment had been in December, and the trial was on the summer calendar, and the newspapers that covered it had done so with the particular precision of outlets covering something that had implications beyond the principal parties. She came in and sat at table 6. Same ban, same corner, same angle through the glass. He brought the coffee without being asked, set it down, did not write a check. She noticed that he hadn't written a check. She said nothing about it. She stayed a little over an hour. He left her alone. He refilled the cup once without being flagged down, because that was what the job was, and because whatever else was true about this particular table, and this particular person, and the long strange arc between them, there was also just the coffee which needed to stay warm. When she stood to go, he was at the station near the register. She buttoned the plain coat, looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not a transaction, not asking for acknowledgement, not preparing for an exchange. Just looking, the way people look at things they're committing to a version of memory that they intend to carry accurately. He looked back. She left. He went to clear the table. Under the saucer was a piece of paper, folded in 4. He stood with the bus tub against his hip and opened it. The handwriting was the same. Small, precise. The handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship and had maintained the habit regardless of whether anyone was watching. Still nothing. This time because there is actually nothing. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket next to the first one, the one he had carried for 4 months, the one that had started all of it, which he had never once taken out, and which he had stopped needing to explain to himself some weeks back. It was just there. A piece of paper in a pocket. The record of a night when someone had finally decided to say what she knew. 2 pieces of paper in a pocket. He went back to work. Brandon was in the corner booth when Anthony's shift ended. He had come in around 10. While Anthony was running the second half of the floor and had settled into the booth with the lost things notebook and what appeared to be a cup of hot chocolate that Tariq had produced without being asked. Because Tariq had a 6th sense for teenagers who had arrived without an agenda but needed somewhere to be. He was asleep when Anthony came to get him. Just gone. tilted sideways, with his cheek against the vinyl, the notebook open on the table in front of him. The hot chocolate cold. Anthony picked up the notebook to put it in the backpack and stopped. The last page had something on it. Not a found object, not a theory or a timeline, or a careful cataloging of something lost. Just 2 words, big, careful, slightly lopsided in the way that handwriting goes, when a person is writing with intention, rather than speed. Dad found. He stood in the corner of the 9th Street Diner at 11:43 on a Thursday night, and held the notebook, and read the 2 words, and did not perform any reaction to them, because there was no performance available that was adequate to the actual weight of what he felt. He closed the notebook carefully, put it in the backpack, touched his son's shoulder until Brandon came back from wherever sleep had taken him. "Hey!" Brandon blinked, located himself. "Sorry, I was going to." "It's fine." Anthony picked up the backpack. "Come on." They walked home through the February night. The city was doing what it did, moving indifferent, continuous. The diner sign visible from 2 blocks off as they turned the corner, still, burning, still orange-yellow, still keeping whatever promise it kept to whoever needed keeping. Brandon walked beside him without speaking. Anthony walked beside his son. That spring, the state legislature passed Senate Bill 1147. The measure established a mandatory dual signature verification standard for all monitoring equipment across the contracted emergency transport fleet. Independent confirmation, outside the supervisory chain. An equipment certification log accessible to the operating crew at the start of every shift, signed by a party not in the direct line of the shift supervisor. The reporting structure required a second acknowledgement at the administrative level within 24 hours of any flagged discrepancy. The debate in committee had been brief. The committee chair had cited the findings from a recent licensing board and proceeding. She had named the unit. She had named the date. In the official record, the protocol was designated by reference number and section. But in the documents produced during the committee testimony, in the letters submitted from the affected community, in the notes of the physician who had testified about the mechanism of the failure in all of those, it was referred to by a different name, informally, consistently, in the way that names take hold when they belong to something. The Latasha Protocol. Anthony read about the passage of the bill on a Wednesday morning at the kitchen table, on his phone while Brandon ate cereal across from him. He read it twice, the way he had started reading things that mattered. He set the phone down. He thought about Latasha Green, not the outline he'd carried for 6 years. 44, 3rd floor, chest pain, 207A. Emium, the actual person. The one whose face he had never found a photograph for. The one whose front door color Vanessa Carter had once been able to recall and could no longer reach. He thought about 31 seconds in the back of a dark vehicle, and numbers on a screen, and a decision made in good faith from bad information, and 6 years of carrying the weight of a sentence he had not written, and had half believed anyway. He thought about a shoebox under a bed, about a child who finds a yellow sheet and uses the blank side, about the particular quality of a person who catalogs lost things, not because they can be returned, most of them, but because every lost thing deserves the record of having mattered to someone. Brandon finished his cereal, put the bowl in the sink, picked up his bag. "Good day today," he said it on his way to the door. The casual tone of the ritual question that wasn't casual. Anthony looked up from the phone. "Yeah," he said. "Good day." Brandon went out. The door closed. Anthony sat at the kitchen table with his coffee in the apartment that smelled like morning, and thought about what it meant to be a man whose name appeared, finally, in a record that told the truth about him. Not the record he'd wanted, the record that existed, the one built from a carbon sheet and a child's drawing, and a woman who couldn't remember a face and a phone call at 4 a.m, and a courier with no return address, and 1 hour and 9 minutes of tape that proved a young man had reported what he found, and been told to log it and run the shift anyway. That record, his name in it, in the right place. Doing what his name had always actually meant. He finished the coffee, He went to get ready for the route.